All right, welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're heading into some really fascinating territory. We're going to be looking at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar at the Roundtable conferences in the early
Oh,
1930s.
this is going to be good.
Yeah, right? Like, talk about a pivotal moment, not just in India's journey to independence, but in, kind of the global fight for social justice. And the best part is we've got access to like a treasure trove of Ambedkar's own speeches and writings from those very conferences.
Oh, wow. So we're getting a real first-hand perspective.
Exactly. It's going to be like we're right there with him in those rooms, listening to him make these powerful arguments.
So it's not just about India's freedom from British rule, right?
Yeah.
Because Dr. Ambedkar was also fighting for, well, you could say freedom from another kind of oppression, the oppression happening within India itself.
You're talking about the depressed classes, what were often called the untouchables at the time.
Exactly. Ambedkar was deeply concerned about their fate in a future independent India.
Yeah, and to really get this, we have to kind of step back and imagine what life was like for them back then. We're not just talking about, some abstract idea of injustice. We're talking about being denied basic human rights.
Yeah, there's actually a 1928 Bombay government report that documented how these communities were denied basic civic rights.
Wow, so it was really that bad, huh? Like even the government was acknowledging it. But what did that actually look like in everyday life?
Well, Dr. Ambedkar, he gives us some really powerful examples in his speeches. He talks about people facing social boycotts
Boycotts. For what?
for things as simple as using a common well or trying to buy land.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah. Imagine, like, just being completely ostracized by your own community
Yeah.
just for trying to access basic necessities.
I can't even.
It's hard to fathom.
It really is. And it wasn't just social ostracization, right? There was
Yeah.
also the economic exploitation.
Oh, absolutely. And Ambedkar talks about how the depressed classes were basically at the mercy of what were known as the orthodox classes, which essentially means the upper castes who controlled all the resources.
So they were what? Like trapped in this system that kept them powerless.
Exactly. And that's why they were so afraid of what would happen even if India got its independence from Britain. Like, would their situation actually improve?
Right. They were probably thinking, okay, we're free from the British, but are we really free?
Yeah. Would they just end up trading one form of oppression for another?
That's a scary thought.
And that's where Ambedkar comes in, right? He was determined to secure some form of protection for the depressed classes within a future independent India.
Yeah, he was fighting for something real, something that went beyond just, promises on paper. He wanted concrete safeguards.
Yeah, he wasn't messing around.
Yeah.
He came to those roundtable conferences with a very clear vision and a list of demands, and he was ready to fight for them.
Okay, so let's get into it. What were those demands? What were his top priorities?
Well, there were three key things: separate electorates, adult suffrage, and strong constitutional safeguards. Each of these was aimed at addressing those deep power imbalances that had kept the depressed classes marginalized for centuries.
Okay, whoa, hold on. That's a pretty bold agenda. I mean, especially considering the whole political landscape at the time.
It was. But let's break it down, okay? Let's start with separate electorates. Now imagine trying to make your voice heard in a room full of people who've always held all the power.
Right, you get drowned out.
That's exactly what Ambedkar was worried about. He said if the depressed classes were just lumped into the general electorate, their votes would be completely overshadowed. So he argued for separate electorates as the only way to guarantee they could actually elect leaders who truly represented their interests.
Ah, okay, so he's saying, look, if we want real change, we need a seat at the table, our own table.
Exactly. He saw it as it's essential, at least initially, to ensure genuine political representation for the depressed classes.
I get it. So that's separate electorates. And then there's adult suffrage, right? Which, I mean, seems pretty obvious to us now, but I'm guessing it was kind of a radical idea back then.
Oh, it absolutely was. Ambedkar believed that every adult, regardless of caste or social standing, should have the right to vote.
I mean, that's the foundation of a true democracy.
Exactly. He saw it as the only way to dismantle those existing power structures that had kept so many people oppressed for so long.
Okay, so separate electorates, adult suffrage. What about those constitutional safeguards he was demanding? What did he have in mind there?
Well, Ambedkar knew that just having nice words written in a document wasn't enough. He insisted on having actual mechanisms in place to guarantee those rights would be enforced.
Ah, so he's thinking about how to make those rights real, not just symbolic.
Exactly. Like, he pushed for the establishment of a strong federal court that would have the power to protect the rights of all citizens, including the depressed classes.
He's really thinking ahead, trying to build a system that would prevent the very things he was fighting against.
Exactly. And he also insisted on having clear consequences for any state or governing body that failed to uphold those rights. He was basically saying, look, justice can't be optional.
That's incredibly forward thinking. I mean, to bring these ideas to the table surrounded by, some of the biggest figures in Indian politics at the time, that must have been intimidating.
Oh, absolutely. It was like walking into a room full of giants and saying, okay, this is how we're going to change the world.
Yeah, that takes some serious guts.
It does. But that's what's so amazing about Dr. Ambedkar. He was not only a visionary leader, but also a master strategist who understood how to navigate those complex dynamics.
I'm already hooked. So what happened next? How did he deal with all those powerful personalities? We've got to find out.
Okay, so try to picture this. Dr. Ambedkar is at these roundtable conferences, right?
Hmm.
He's surrounded by all these powerful figures, each with their own agendas.
It sounds like a real pressure cooker. And I know he wasn't afraid to, ruffle some feathers with those demands for the depressed classes. Did he find any common ground with the other groups at the table?
Well, yeah, I mean, there were definitely some shared concerns, right? Like, remember, there were lots of other minority groups who were worried about being marginalized in a newly independent India. They feared that the Hindu majority wouldn't fully respect their rights.
Right. So they were kind of all united by this fear of what, like being overshadowed in a new political system.
Exactly. And this kind of put Ambedkar in a tough spot, Like, on one hand, he was definitely aligned with these other minority groups in calling for safeguards against majority rule.
Right. Because everyone wants a fair shake.
Yeah. But here's the thing. Ambedkar was adamant that the depressed classes were not just another minority group.
That's right. He was really clear about that. But why was that distinction so important to him?
Because, for Ambedkar, the oppression faced by the depressed classes was different. It was much deeper than just political marginalization.
Ah, I see what you mean.
It was like woven into the very fabric of Indian society. It was rooted in centuries of prejudice and social exclusion.
So he's basically saying, look, we're not just talking about political power here. This is about dismantling a whole system of oppression.
Exactly.
Mm.
He understood that political freedom wouldn't automatically translate into social and economic justice for the depressed classes.
Right, because just getting rid of British rule wouldn't magically erase centuries of discrimination.
Right, exactly. So he knew he had to be bold. He had to shake things up and make those in power really grasp the depth of the problem.
And he definitely wasn't afraid to use strong language, was he? I remember reading that he said the depressed classes had no friend in this fight. Not the British, not the Indian nationalists.
He was drawing a line in the sand, for sure. At that time, even talking about untouchability was taboo. It was like the elephant in the room that nobody wanted to acknowledge.
Right. So by speaking out so forcefully, he's really challenging the whole foundation of Indian society. He's making people confront a reality they'd rather ignore.
Exactly. And that took incredible courage, especially given, the whole power dynamic at play.
Okay, so I'm really curious. How did everyone else at the conference react to this?
Oh, it was a mixed bag. Like, the British, for example, they were in a tricky position. They wanted to appear progressive and sympathetic to the depressed classes. But they were also super hesitant to do anything that might upset the Hindu or Muslim leaders.
Yeah, that's classic colonialism, right? Trying to play both sides.
Exactly. And then you had the Muslim leaders who, while also advocating for minority rights, sometimes saw the depressed classes as potential allies in their own struggle against what they saw as Hindu dominance.
It's almost like everyone's trying to use the situation to their advantage.
Right. It was very strategic. But Ambedkar, he saw right through it. He refused to be anyone's pawn. He was laser-focused on what was best for the depressed classes, regardless of any political alliances.
That's so important. He wasn't interested in playing those political games. He was playing the long game, fighting for lasting change.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, the depressed classes weren't really organized at that time. They didn't have the same kind of political clout as, say, the Indian National Congress or the Muslim League.
Right, so he really had to rely on his own intellect and his ability to persuade people.
He had to be sharp and strategic, and he was.
So we've talked about the dire situation of the depressed classes and Ambedkar's vision for change, but what about the nitty-gritty of the negotiations? Were there any big sticking points that came up during these conferences?
Oh, yeah. Things got pretty intense, especially around the issue of separate electorates.
Ah, yes, separate electorates. Tell me more about that. Why was this such a big deal?
Well, Ambedkar saw separate electorates as absolutely essential. He argued that in a joint electorate, the votes of the depressed classes would just be swallowed up by the majority. They wouldn't have a real voice.
So he's saying they need their own separate voting system to ensure they have a chance to elect representatives who actually represent their interests.
Exactly. He saw it as the only way to guarantee genuine political representation for the depressed classes.
Okay, that makes sense. But wait a minute. Wasn't Gandhi totally opposed to separate electorates?
Oh yeah, he was. Gandhi believed that separate electorates would further divide Indian society. He thought it would create a permanent rift between different communities.
So Gandhi's pushing for integration, right? He thinks that oppressed classes should be brought within the fold of Hinduism and have their interests protected through reserved seats in a joint electorate.
You got it. And this fundamental disagreement, well, it led to one of the most dramatic moments in the whole Indian independence movement, Gandhi's threat to fasten to death in opposition to separate electorates.
Wait, seriously. Gandhi was willing to put his life on the line over this issue. That's
Oh, it
intense.
was a huge deal. Gandhi was like a saint to millions of people, and the thought of him dying for this cause sent shockwaves throughout the country.
I can only imagine the pressure that must have put on Ambedkar. Like, how do you even respond to that?
Right. It was a true dilemma for him. On the one hand, he had this unwavering commitment to the depressed classes, and on the other hand, he had this incredibly powerful figure threatening to die over this issue.
So what did he do? Did he give in?
Well, it was complicated. Ambedkar knew that Gandhi's death could spark widespread violence and unrest, and he didn't want to be responsible for that. But at the same time, he couldn't just abandon his core principles. So there were these really intense negotiations, and they finally reached a compromise known as the Pune Pact of 1932.
The Pune Pact. Okay, tell me everything. What were the terms of this agreement?
So basically, in the Pune Pact, Ambedkar agreed to give up the demand for separate electorates in exchange for a larger number of reserved seats for the depressed classes within the provincial legislatures.
Ah, okay. So instead of having their own separate voting rolls, they would be voting alongside caste Hindus, but with a guaranteed number of seats specifically for their community.
Exactly. It wasn't a perfect solution by any means, and Ambedkar definitely had his doubts about it.
Right, because it's still not true equality.
Yeah, it was a compromise. But it did avert the immediate crisis of Gandhi's fast, and it secured at least some political representation for the depressed classes.
So it's like a step in the right direction, but maybe not the giant leap forward that Ambedkar had originally hoped for.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But this definitely wasn't the end of Ambedkar's fight for the rights of the depressed classes. Not even close.
So what happened next? Where did he go from there?
Well, after the Pune Pact, there were still these, big questions about how the rights of the depressed classes would actually be protected in practice.
Right, because just having a few reserved seats in the legislature doesn't automatically solve all the problems.
Exactly. And that's where the 1933 Joint Committee hearings in London come in. These were essentially a really detailed review of the proposed Indian Constitution.
Oh, wow. So this is where the rubber meets the road. They're actually trying to hash out the details of how this new government is going to work.
Exactly. And Ambedkar saw this as a crucial opportunity. He wanted to make sure that the rights of the depressed classes were, woven into the very fabric of the new India.
He's not letting up, is he? He's making sure they don't get overlooked in all the excitement of creating a new nation.
Oh, not at all. He was like a bulldog. He relentlessly questioned witnesses, grilling them on how the Constitution would actually impact the depressed classes. He wanted specifics. He wasn't going to settle for vague assurances.
That's what I love about Ambedkar. He's always thinking ahead, always pushing for concrete solutions. So what were some of his biggest concerns during these hearings?
Well, he was worried about a whole range of things, like discrimination in access to education and jobs, how legal rights would actually be enforced, stuff like that.
So he's not just focused on political representation, he's also thinking about the social and economic conditions that would allow the depressed classes to truly thrive.
Exactly. He knew that true equality required systemic change. It wasn't just about passing laws. It was about creating a society where everyone had a real chance to succeed.
It's amazing how he's fighting for this kind of holistic vision of justice.
He was way ahead of his time.
So, looking back, do you think all those efforts, all those years of struggle were ultimately successful?
I mean, it's a tough question. There's no doubt that the Pune Pact and the constitutional provisions led to some progress. The depressed classes did gain more political representation, and their concerns started to be addressed, at least to some extent.
Right, but it probably wasn't the, complete transformation he was hoping for.
Yeah, unfortunately, those deep-seated prejudices and discriminatory practices were hard to change overnight.
It's a reminder that achieving true equality is a long, hard process.
It is. But Ambedkar's life and work are so inspiring. He shows us that it is possible to fight for justice, to speak truth to power, even when the odds seem stacked against you.
His story is so relevant today, isn't it? I mean, we're still grappling with so many of the same issues: social exclusion, discrimination, the dangers of unchecked majority rule.
Absolutely. Ambedkar's legacy challenges us to confront those injustices, to use our voices to advocate for those who are marginalized.
To keep pushing for a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. He shows us that the fight for justice is never truly over.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Dr. Ambedkar's role at the Roundtable conferences, what do you hope our listeners will take away from his story?
I think the biggest takeaway is that each of us has a role to play in shaping a better future. Ambedkar's life is a testament to the power of courage, the power of persistence, the power of believing that change is possible.
It's a powerful message, and it's something we all need to remember no matter where we are in the world or what challenges we're facing. Thanks for taking us on this incredible journey, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.